So my name is Anne Parkinson, and I am here on Salt Spring. I'm a long-term marine biologist and part of the Transition Salt Spring group, where we've started a small marine stewardship program. So I'm really happy to be involved in this course. We're going to go tonight, our third night, from the largest to the smallest whales to seaweed. And before we get started, I just want to say a quick thank you to Transition Salt Spring. We are hosting this evening. We're hosting the entire course, all 4 evenings, and it really is a pleasure to be involved with this. I'd like to introduce our speaker, John Kalambokabis, and we did practice that name. John, did I get it right?
Close enough.
Close enough. Okay. John's going to be speaking on a topic, of course, we all love here in the Salish Sea about whales, but specifically sounders, the gray whales of the Salish Sea. And since 1990, John's been compiling observations on gray whales visiting Puget Sound and around the Salish Sea, and he calls them sounders, and we'll figure out why. And this data is opening up a whole new window onto the sounders world. And John is a senior research biologist and one of the founders of Cascadia Research Collective, which is a nonprofit research organization formed in 1979 based in Olympia, Washington. So this is great. And after John's presentation, we'll have a chat, time for a bit of a chat, questions. Please enter them in the chat listing, and we will moderate them and get through as many questions as we possibly can. So very nice to see you, John. Over to you.
I'm going to be talking about the gray whales of the Salish Sea tonight, and especially focus on the group of whales we call the sounders. I'll give you a little background on whales, talk a little bit about some of the overall developments occurring with gray whales, because we have some very interesting events going on with gray whales that the sounders actually fit into. And then focus in on these sounders gray whales that occur inside the Salish Sea and tell you why we named them the sounders. Before I do that, I'll maybe introduce who I am and the work that I do. I'm part of Cascadia Research Collective. It's a nonprofit based in Olympia, Washington. We have a program that Robin Baird heads that involves Hawaii Odontocetes, but most of the work I've been doing since I founded Cascadia in 1979 has focused on large whales along the US West Coast, extending up to Alaska through Canada and sometimes down to Central America. And I would say this poster kind of covers some of the range of things we do. We do long-term photo identification of whales, especially humpback whales, blue whales, and gray whales. We look at abundance and trends, some of our data on humpback and blue whales, as well as the Pacific Coast Feeding Group. The photo ID serves as the basis for the abundance estimates of those populations, and we track those. We try to identify important feeding areas. We're working on a manuscript right now on biologically important feeding areas. We study different human impacts on whales, including some of their effects of Navy sonar on them, as well as things like ship strike and entanglements. We do actively research strandings of large whales throughout Washington state and are involved with that. And then recently we've been doing quite a bit of effort with tag deployments, especially suction cup attached archival tags. And we've deployed hundreds of these tags on some of the large whale species, partly to gain insight on their biology and what they do underwater, but also it turns out to be one of our key ways to evaluate some of the impacts, like their reaction to things like Navy mid-frequency sonar, or how they react or interact with approach of large ships. So that's kind of some of the work that we do. At the heart of it has been photo identification. And I mentioned 3 species, humpback whales, gray whale, and blue whales, that we've been doing photo identification. And that table at the bottom left is, shows a little bit of our history of that work. They all go back to the 1980s or 90s. For all 3 of those species, we have thousands of different individuals identified and tens of thousands of encounters that have been documented. And with large baleen whales, unlike, say, something like southern resident killer whales, the populations are much larger. So we're not so much trying to identify every single individual, but used photo identification to track some key elements about them. And I've just got 3 arrows here describing kind of 3 key things we do with these photo identifications for all 3 of these species. I'll mention we mostly get our photo identifications from small boats. We have 3 of these rigid hull inflatable boats that we operate all along the West Coast up into Canada. This one shows the smallest one we have. They're all Hurricanes made in Canada that we utilize for this work, and they're all of them have bow pulpits, so we can more easily do some of our work in things like tag deployments. The photo identification, it varies. With humpback whales, we're using the underside of flukes. With gray whales and blue whales, which are the next 2 shown there on the left here, I think you can probably see my cursor here. We use the sides of the whales and some of the markings on the sides of the whales to track them. And those photo IDs, this first prong is showing you that it's a very powerful tool for us to calculate abundance. So even though we don't identify every single individual in the population, we're able to use something called mark recapture statistics to estimate the overall abundance, which includes the animals that maybe haven't been identified. And that's a major tool for the West Coast populations of humpback whales, for the Eastern North Pacific population of blue whales. Those are both based on our mark recapture estimates. And in the case of gray whales, we use it to estimate the abundance of what's called the Pacific Coast feeding group of gray whales that I'll describe to you in more detail in a second. We also use it to describe that middle prong, migration and movements of animals, both along the West Coast, but also between some of their feeding and winter areas. Some of these insets just show the types of data we gather on movements of animals or how they go to different breeding areas, in this case, focused on humpback whales. And we also use it to track survival and mortality of animals, and in the case of especially entangled whales, how they might survive entanglements. And we recently published a paper on that. So that's just some of the general ways we use photo ID. Now, getting into a little bit of the background of gray whales, and I know this will be a little bit complicated, but I want to sort of break down the gray whales I'm going to talk about into 4 different groups. There's the overall Eastern North Pacific gray whale population that winters and breeds primarily in the lagoons of Mexico. This area I'm circling here makes this long migration, one of the longest of any mammal, only rivaled by humpback whales, to their primary feeding areas up here in the US, Canadian, and Russian Arctic. And that's this area in red. And that's the main migration route these gray whales pass through. And that's the larger Eastern North Pacific gray whale population. But there's also a Western North Pacific gray whale population that used to be far more abundant than it is now. It's currently numbers in the hundreds of individuals. It primarily feeds in an area off the Sea of Okhotsk off Sakhalin Island. It was thought historically to primarily migrate to winter breeding grounds down off China. But that whole picture has gotten a little obscured because some of the surviving animals using this feeding area in the Western North Pacific, when they were satellite tagged or when photo identification matches were compared, many of them, it turns out, were making the migration over to the breeding areas in the Eastern North Pacific and not going to China. And that sort of raised some questions about what happened to the historical Western North Pacific population. Does it still exist as a subset of that? How has that population reacted to the fact that it has numbered so few animals? And are the animals using some of the areas in the Western North Pacific potentially part of this expanding, recovering Eastern North Pacific population. So anyway, that's the second unit, Western North Pacific gray whales. And then I'm going to talk about this group called the PCFG, the Pacific Coast Feeding Group is what that stands for. And this is a group first described by Jim Darling working off Vancouver Island. There had been historically these sightings outside the migration period of gray whales using especially Pacific Northwest waters from Northern California up into Southeast Alaska. And Jim's work off Vancouver Island started to initially track these animals with photo identification, showing it was some of the same animals returning every year. And for a while, there have been a variety of names applied to that group. For a while, they were called either seasonal residents or summer resident gray whales. But now more recently, they've been termed the Pacific Coast feeding group or feeding aggregation. And in green here is this area they primarily feed. It primarily goes from Northern California up through Southeast Alaska, though we have matches that extend even further north into Alaskan waters, but their primary area is this area right in here for the Pacific Coast Feeding Group. And these whales do go down to Mexico and Baja to breed, so they interbreed with the overall population. There's some debate about how to treat that group, whether it represents a distinct group from the overall Eastern North Pacific population. Some of the genetics work and the photo ID work, I think, strongly supports the case that the Pacific Coast Feeding Group is a unique group, that even though it interbreeds with the larger Eastern North Pacific population of gray whales, its annual return of animals to the same areas, the fact a lot of the recruitment comes internally. It's calves of Pacific Coast Feeding Group gray whales that then travel with their mothers to feed and then return annually to this area. And some of the genetic studies, especially using mitochondrial DNA, which is a type of DNA that's transmitted maternally just from the mother to her offspring, have shown significant differences between those, the mix of mitochondrial DNA haplotypes in the Pacific Coast Feeding Group is statistically significant different than the Eastern North Pacific population that feeds up in Alaskan waters. Canada recognizes those as different groups. The US currently does not. And then now shifting to the last group, which will be the focus of much of my talk, and that's these whales that break off from the migration, come into the Salish Sea, which we see here. This is the inset on the map over here, is blown up over here, and feed especially in this area of northern Puget Sound that stretch from Whidbey Island, Camino Island, Possession Point, all the way up. So it's primarily US waters here where this regular group of animals returns, and I'll show you a little bit about them. They are part of the overall Eastern North Pacific population because these whales, these sounders gray whales, come in and feed in the spring, but then continue on. Unlike the Pacific Coast Feeding Group that stay and feed through the summer and fall, the sounders seem to feed as a stopover to a larger migration. Okay, I know that was a lot to take in, and we'll come back to some of these points. This was from an earlier paper we did about biologically important feeding areas for different large whale species. And this is this area of Puget Sound around Whidbey Island, and the shaded area shows this area we designated in 2015. We're doing a revision of this paper that expands this slightly, but not too much. But this shaded area shows this relatively small area that these sounders gray whales use, and use very intensely. Now, gray whales, feed in a number of ways, but kind of their hallmark, if you will, among all the baleen whales is their ability to feed directly on the bottom and actually filter feed some of the sediment and organisms that live in the bottom. But I'll kind of caution, in generalizing too much about gray whales. We used to think, and when I say we, I mean scientists used to view gray whales as a really fairly specialized feeder. But in reality, it's turned out that gray whales are probably one of the most versatile and opportunistic feeders of any of the baleen whales. And when I say, I'm going to come back to this slide, but I'm going to go ahead one slide and then come back. Because when I say baleen whales, I should maybe show you baleen. And these are a couple of, maybe I've become a little callous to this, and I'm sorry if this is a little bit off-putting here, but this is the outside of the mouth of a gray whale showing these baleen plates hanging down. And this rather gory picture is from a stranded gray whale where we're actually looking through the lower jaw at the roof of the mouth. And this is the baleen from the inside. We could call this the krill or the ghost shrimp view of baleen. And typically when people show baleen, they show this, and it looks like these plates hanging down. But the working part of the baleen is what you see coming off the bottom and the inside edge of the baleen, which it turns into these frill-like hairs that baleen whales have and are actually what do the filtering, not these plates. These plates are almost just a support for that. And looking at the inside of the baleen, you see all these hairs and frills coming off the inside edge of the baleen form this dense sieve-like mat that is incredibly effective at filtering out anything solid that is pushed through it. So like most baleen whales, gray whales take the mixture of food, water, in the case of gray whales, sediment into their mouth. And then they filter it, pushing it back through this baleen, which leaves any large items, including any prey items, on the inside of this baleen for them to then be able to swallow. And overall, baleen and these hairs can vary in how thick they are by species of whales. For example, in bowhead whales and right whales that feed on some of the smallest creatures, including copepods, they have very fine hairs, and it forms a very, very fine mesh to catch very small organisms. Gray whales have a coarser mesh, indicating they're trying to catch larger prey than this. And these hairs have a lot of strength and robust. So let me go back to this slide here that I was on. And, this aerial image of a gray whale, and this was taken quite a few years ago. We have much better images now, but I still show this one here that shows an aerial view of a gray whale with its head and its tail here surfacing. And you see this stream of mud trailing behind the whale. And this was, a characteristic of gray whales that had gone down to the bottom, typically in shallow water, sucked in this mouthful of the slurry of sediment and water and prey, and then in filtering it out, leave this plume of mud behind them that can be readily identified from the air. And this photograph was actually taken in the Strait of Juan de Fuca, but it would be typical of gray whales feeding many areas when they are engaged in benthic feeding. But I mentioned that gray whales aren't at all limited to benthic feeding. And in fact, many of the Pacific Coast Feeding Group gray whales can feed on swarms of mysid shrimp, or in areas off Vancouver Island, they'll feed on herring spawn. And I've seen them feeding in areas amongst humpback whales, feeding on krill in the water column. So that's where they can utilize a variety of strategies. And whereas some whales like right whales or bowhead whales filter feed by kind of swimming through the water, taking water in through the front of their mouth and filtering it so that it goes out the side. The rorqual whales, which are the humpback whales and blue whales and fin whales, they're engulfment feeders. They have throat pleats that let them distend their throats and engulf a large amount of prey. Gray whales sort of have the ability to distend their throat a little bit. They have just a few throat pleats, but there's still a little bit of mystery of exactly how do they suck in this sediment, how do they feed on other organisms. So it's still kind of an interesting question we're trying to study. And I'll show you a little bit of the indications we've gotten from some of the research we've done. But some of the amazing stuff that's gone on with research by researchers at University of Victoria, including Dave Duffus, researchers down here in Washington, Oregon, and California, have identified this wide variety of prey that even the Pacific Coast Feeding Group gray whales feed on, and there's a wide variety of prey. Now the Sounders gray whales, which I've shown you just a few slides of, turn out to be specialists on feeding on intertidal ghost shrimp. And when I say intertidal ghost shrimp, that means they're feeding in areas that are high and dry at low tide, and they can only access at high tide, because some of these areas have some of the densest ghost shrimp prey densities are in the intertidal zone, and the gray whales have learned to take advantage of that. And so when they come in at high tide to feed, like this photograph here, there's often barely enough water for them to even be fully submerged. You'll see, in this case, pieces of pec fins and part of their flukes out of the water as they try to feed in this really shallow water. And then when the tide goes out, and this is an aerial photograph of a mudflat in the Snohomish River Delta near Whidbey Island. Each of these little dimples that you see here is a feeding pit made by a gray whale at high tide that's now exposed at low tide. And these feeding pits are about 6, 7, 8 feet long and about 3 or 4 feet wide. And the whale, by having excavated this, mostly with suction, has created a depression that then has pooled water. And that's what, there are hundreds of these feeding pits visible at low tide in this area here, made by gray whales feeding. And I'll show you some of the ways we've been able to use that very visible mechanism that whales feed on. Now, an integral part of the story of the sounders and gray whales is to talk for a second about the larger scale gray whale population and how it's doing, because some of what we've now discovered about the sounders gray whales ties in really closely to this. You saw earlier that gray whales make this large migration from Mexico up to the Arctic waters. And in several periods, there's normally strandings all along their route. But most recently, starting in 2019, we had a dramatic increase in number of strandings documented of gray whales. And in that first year, 2019, if you look down this column here, you'll see over 200 gray whales were documented washing up all along their range. These are strandings from 2019 primarily, just barely going into 2020, that big first year that had the largest number of strandings. And you can see they occurred from the breeding lagoons in Mexico, these occurring primarily in December, January, February, along the migration route extending into March and April. We get our peak mortality in Washington State in April, May, and into June. And then some of these mortalities up into Alaskan waters occur later in the year. And these hundreds of mortalities are dramatic enough, but many, and in fact, we think it's probably the vast majority, maybe 80% of the gray whales that die, we think never wash up on shore and never get documented. So when 200 get documented, the true number is likely well over 1,000 animals that died, and potentially thousands, because most of these gray whales, that especially these that are emaciated, would sink when they die. And if they sink in deep enough water, even when they try to bloat, that wouldn't counteract the pressure. It's only if they sink in shallow water would that bloating bring them to the surface, and then they'd wash up on a beach, or sometimes they would just drift offshore and not come ashore. So you see some these numbers, even though over this 4-year period we have 500 strandings documented, as I say, the true number is something on the order of 5 times that much, because of all those that go undiscovered. And this shows, peak period for that mortality has generally been in springtime into early summer. That's the period when gray whales are making that northern migration. It's when they've been through that seasonal fast of largely not feeding on the breeding ground, so they would be at their poorest nutritional condition. And that's where any nutritional stress or any inability to have gotten enough to feed on the previous year would start to become most critical to gray whale survival. In Washington State, we've been doing stranding response going back, to our inception, and I was involved in stranding response going back even before that to the mid 1970s. But it's been a key part of our research. Jesse Huggins, who's shown here, is our stranding coordinator. Even during the peak COVID years of 2020, Jesse managed with a small team to continue the stranding response. So we've been able to document the annual strandings, especially of gray whales in Washington State, quite well. And this is what that has revealed. So now I've focused in just to Washington State. And now you see the annual number of strandings of gray whales in Washington State. And you'll see there's quite a bit of variation year to year in this, but you'll see here's 1999, 2000 right here. That was another unusual mortality event that lasted 2 years. And we had 50 gray whales die in the 2 years combined. And here's that huge peak in 2019, the more recent unusual mortality event, and the decreased mortality we've seen each of the subsequent years. But the unusual mortality event has been kept active, partly because even in 2020 and 21, these numbers of strandings were well above what has been the long-term average. And for Washington State, you can see this very clear peak of April, May, and June is our peak period for strandings of gray whales. Now, what's been going on with the overall gray whale population that might explain a little bit of this mortality is that overall, the Eastern North Pacific gray whale population has been recovering. This shows data going back to 1967 from some of the annual counts that NOAA conducts and estimates of abundance from their counts of migrating gray whales. And you can see gray whales were increasing pretty steadily in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. It did seem like starting in the 1990s, you see a drop in gray whale numbers, and especially that other big mortality event in 1999, 2000 brought it down further. But you can see even since that 1999, 2000 mortality event, gray whale numbers had reached record numbers, estimated at some 27,000 in the late 2010s, right before this 2019 unusual mortality event. So part of what might be going on with gray whales is a combination of factors involving limited prey, but also a recovering gray whale population reaching numbers that we think they were close to prior to commercial whaling. So they may be reaching the limits or the carrying capacity of the environment, and therefore much more sensitive and vulnerable to any variations in their prey abundance. You can see the most recent abundance estimate for North Pacific gray whales again implied this drop having occurred likely from that 2019-20 mortality event. So some of the considerations in this unusual mortality event are that Eastern North Pacific gray whales were at record levels prior to the UME. We are concerned about environmental changes because there have been dramatic decreases in ice cover in the Arctic and changes in the Arctic environment. In the past, lower ice was generally correlated with higher gray whale calf production. And this seemed to be because when there was lower ice, gray whales could get further north, access areas earlier and further. But that might be a short-term benefit that could mask what is that doing to overall productivity of the benthic environment in the Arctic. Gray whales did seem to survive the 1999-2000 UME and bounced back to record levels. And there's a variety of things being looked at for potential causes of the unusual mortality event. One interesting thing is that the Pacific Coast Feeding Group, while it's shown some up and down variation in numbers, has remained fairly steady and not shown quite the level of dramatic up and down variations that the overall Eastern North Pacific gray whale population has shown. Now, there is a proposed resumption by the Makah tribe for an Aboriginal hunt of gray whales. They took a whale in May 1999, which is what the photographs on the left are. The photograph on the right are actually from one of the last whales they took in the early 1900s when gray whale populations were really depleted and at low levels, and the Makah suspended their hunt for gray whales. And now they're looking to resume it after the 1999 hunt. There was a legal challenge that required NOAA to prepare an environmental impact statement and grant a waiver of the Marine Mammal Protection Act in the US. Some of that looks like it's coming to the completion of its cycle, and we may see the Makah whale hunt resume in the near future. Now, the Sounders gray whales I mentioned, we have quite a few projects that we conduct with them. We continue to document individual arrival dates and departure dates for them. We look at changes in their number of gray whales and also their estimated consumption of ghost shrimp, which is a function of how many whales, how long they're staying, what areas of they're using, and how much are they consuming. We've conducted these deployments of these suction cup attached tags that I'll show you some of the results from. We're particularly trying to focus a little bit on the vocal behavior of the Sounders gray whales and some of their interactions with vessels. And then I'll show you a little bit of a joint project we're doing with John Durbin and Holly Fernbach, looking at their body condition and health condition using UAS-based assessments. Now, I mentioned those feeding pits that gray whales produce in the intertidal zone. And we've actually been able to use Google Earth as a great tool to document these. So these two images on this page are actually taken directly from Google Earth. And this is a blow up of an area on Google Earth. And you can see all of these little pits that you see here. These are gray whale feeding pits that you can blow up and zoom in on Google Earth. And here there are 50 to 100 pits in this area here, a little bit further down the tide line. There are also hundreds of these pits. And in fact, on Google Earth, you can cycle through historical images. So we've done that. And one of our former interns and students did a project on this, and using the multiple images, he was able to plot close to 20,000 feeding pits of these Sounders gray whales visible on Google Earth images. And this is taking one area off Everett and the Snohomish River Delta. And what looks like white here is actually thousands of single points that Nathan Harrison, who did this work, was able to mark individual pits of gray whales from multiple photographs. And it allowed us to map the gray whales, the areas gray whales feed, which include this large delta area, as well as along the coast and up the coast in these shallow waters. Now the delta extends out to here, and some of these areas are over a kilometer from deeper waters. So the gray whales have to get into this intertidal area, sometimes going in a kilometer or more to get there to find some of these feeding areas and feed. So it's a pretty risky strategy, given this is an area that's high and dry at low tide. We see these feeding pits in other parts, and we also documented that these feeding pits dramatically increased in frequency, starting with the 2019 UME, and I'll show you a little bit about why that was. Now, the Sounders gray whales initially started as 6 gray whales, then it doubled to 12 gray whales, and now we're up to about 20 Sounders gray whales. And we define a Sounder gray whale as a whale seen in this March to June period and seen in multiple years returning to this area. And some of the whales are very distinctive. This is one of our most distinctive whales we called Patch. It was our CRC 49. It was the 49th whale we identified. It had this very distinctive depigmented area that made it easy to track and identify. Now,
John, can
Yep.
I interrupt for 2 seconds?
Yes.
There is a gray bar at the top of the title of your slide. Do you have any idea what that's from? We don't think it's on our end. Sorry to interrupt.
Is it obscuring some of the title here?
Just a little bit of the title. Is there any way to fix that? No, not a problem. I mean, I think your slides are very clear. It's just, I wanted to mention that, and I'm not going to keep you for any more time. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. And I'm not sure I spot a way to avoid here. So, but thank you for letting me know.
Okay, well, let's not delay.
Yeah. So in this figure here, each of these rows is a different sounder gray whale. These have numbers, but some have these names, like Shackleton and Earhart are two pioneering sounder gray whales we first documented in 1990 using this area. And you'll see those two whales that we identified in 1990 have been seen all the way through 2022, where I saw them both 2 days ago out in that area. So these whales have been returning to this area for over 32 years. The green shows years that we documented and saw them. The white means we didn't see it that year. And especially some of the white areas in these early years is probably the result of the low effort we had. We only began to intensely studying these gray whales starting in around 2013. And that's also when whale watch activities started more regularly. Excuse me, I'm at 2003, in the early 2000s. And that's when whale watch activity started, and that helped supplement documenting which individuals were present. But still, you can see a remarkably consistent occurrence of some of these whales, you know, over many years. And some of these patches might be, again, due to just the few surveys we did that year, we missed them. But you'll also notice that we have the sex of many of these whales identified, and the majority of them are male. And we have only a few documented females. And one of them is one of our pioneering females that we named Earhart. And you'll notice something distinctive, even in the years that we've had more consistent effort. You'll see every 2 to 5, 6 years, Earhart doesn't show up. And one thing that's interesting, despite having a number of females, we have never seen any of these females come to this area with a calf. So what we think this seems to perfectly match the reproductive cycle of likely this female, Earhart. And these are probably the years she had a calf and she did not come to the northern Puget Sound. Mothers with calves migrate a little bit later, and they're a little bit slower on their migration. That might lead her to forego coming to this area to feed, but it also may be the result of the fact that this would be a very dangerous area for her to bring her calf. And maybe I'm realizing, of course, that I've got to try to wrap up here in the next 10 minutes or so. So I'm going to go a little faster on a few things and cut to some slides of that I really want to make sure to show you. But I do want to highlight that you can see new sounders joined in 1990-91. They joined again, and the number doubled in 1999-2000. And then here, starting in 2019, we've had a new cohort of sounders that's taken our numbers to these increased numbers. And when you superimpose the number of new sounders, which are these faint gray bars matching the right scale, and when they join the group, on top of that earlier figure I showed you of number of strandings, you will notice that sounders gray whales joined the population primarily during high mortality years. 1990-91 were a pair of years with elevated mortality. 1999-2000 was that earlier mortality event I mentioned. And then you can see starting here in 2019, we've seen new sounders join this population. And that kind of answered our question of what would motivate gray whales to come over 100 miles off their migratory pathway and explore and search for new feeding grounds and discover and utilize what we would consider a pretty high risk feeding strategy. And it looks like what motivates that is desperation. It's in years where these whales were experiencing high mortality. They were under nutritional stress from their feeding in the Arctic, and they were searching for new areas to feed. And once they found them and discovered them, that's the amazing thing about these sounders. They then learned to return to that spot regularly and take advantage of it. In case you haven't heard a gray whale call, this is this is some of the work Hannah Clayton has been doing with the sounders. That was the low rumble and roar of a gray whale call from one of our tags. I mentioned that UAS work we've been doing with John Durbin and Holly Fernbach that gets these great vertical photographs of gray whale body condition. And for example, these 3 photographs show you the changing body condition of one whale, in this case, a whale we call Lucifer 723. And just over a period of weeks, you can see it get noticeably girthier progressively through feeding on this ghost shrimp. So they clearly are able to bulk up on this feeding. And John and Holly with their work have shown this index of whale condition significantly improved by Julian day just within a season. And they've also been able to describe some of these known females, like able to see that whale 22 in the year before she didn't show up, Earhart, was noticeably girthier farther back on her body, suggesting pregnancy. And that predicted that the next year she didn't show up, and fit with our data of some of these known females being pregnant in some of these years. Okay, I want to show you a few clips of tagging before taking some of your questions here. We do deploy these tags on a variety of whale species. This is approaching a blue whale off Southern California. The tags we've deployed on the Sounders gray whales have primarily been these suction cup attached multi-sensor video tags. So they have video cameras to record usually 4 to 6 hours of video, but they have internal sensors that give us three-dimensional accelerometry, temperature, GPS position, depth, and I'll show you some of that data, as well as getting these video tags. And deploying these tags on Sounders gray whales, has been well, maybe I'll show you. Let me go back. I'm just going to show you a little bit of this video here. This is deploying on humpback whales off California. And this is video footage below here is from my point of view.
Got a whale just ahead of me, John, to my left.
This is the view of James. And positioning behind a group of humpbacks and continuing and deploying the seagull. We're trying to position at the back of the group, and a humpback whale will surface within reach in front of the boat here. And James is able to select that tag just on his back. That's now this tag is able to record all this data from the whale, and I'll jump. Oop, I jumped more ahead than I wanted to, and I'll jump higher in the video here and just play a little bit of this video. And now you see in this case we had forward and backward facing video recording this whale as it moved and approached a school of anchovies in this case. And accelerated into them to feed on this school of anchovies. Right there, you'll see sea lions and seabirds feeding in the same area, but I'm gonna move down to show you some of the data we were getting from the Sounders gray whales. This is a 37-hour record off one of the Sounder tag deployments on a whale in 2016. And this is a 37-hour record. Time is on the x-axis, and we're plotting several things. This is how deep the whale was diving in each of its dives. We have the roll sensor that measured the whale rolling on its side. And we also have shown the tidal cycle here is this oscillation you see. And you can see the gray whales were feeding, this gray whale was feeding just during these windows right here shown in blue. Which is where it corresponded with the high tide cycle, and especially the leading edge of the high tide cycle. It's a lot safer to be on these mud flats as the tide is rising than when it's going down. And
one more minute, please, John.
yes, you bet.
Thank you.
And these gave us this detailed picture of the gray whales feeding, which it also showed some of our interaction with gray whales, like this tag here that we had on a gray whale. This was on Earhart. And shortly after we tagged the whale, this other tag came along and ended up making body contact with Earhart and turning the tag around to face backwards instead of forward. And that tag actually ended up capturing some of these whales following Earhart into the shallow water. And in this case, you'll actually see there end up, if I jump ahead here, you'll actually see 3 gray whales, one here, and one here, following Earhart into the shallows. And it also captured these gray whales kind of feeding on the bottom, where they go down to the bottom and then create these plumes. This is a gray whale with its head on the bottom. These are ghost shrimp tunnels. And then it, through in and out suction, it's able to suck its prey. You'll actually see a ghost shrimp stream by here that got away from this gray whale. So we're able to document some of that feeding. So I think this is a good place for me to stop. I was going to describe a little bit about the entanglement risk gray whales feed. I was going to show you some records of some of the successful disentanglements we've had of gray whales that have worked out well, but I'm going to cut instead to my final conclusion slide, just to talk a little bit about, how the sounders appear to be these whales that have discovered this new off-migration feeding area and learned to return to it. How some of these new tools are letting us study the sounders and identify how they're feeding, and how we hope to, learn to protect and look at some of the conflicts they face and reduce some of the threats they face. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. I don't know if there's time for a few questions here, if we have a few minutes before 7:55 to take a few questions.
Exactly. Oh, John, that was just fabulous. I mean, I just couldn't stop with those videos going. That's incredible. We have all kinds of comments in the chat. Oh my God, absolutely amazing. So thank you. That's really wonderful. Well, there are a few questions. We've got our, few minutes here. So I'll start, Liz, if you want to jump in. But one of the first was so it doesn't look like they use bubble nets for feeding. They just jam their head in and suction.
Yes, exactly. And some of the mechanics of how they're generating that suction is key. But what we can see they do, they roll 90 degrees, almost always on their right side, and put the right side of their mouth against the bottom. And then they open their mouth part way and start generating this in and out suction. And you can actually, there are a few cases where underwater video have been, gathered not just from tags, but from someone getting it. And you actually see some of this pulsing action as this slurry comes out the side of their mouth through the baleen and filters out those ghost shrimp.
That is amazing. So do they also feed on sand lance, or is this 100% ghost shrimp? Or anything else? No?
Yes, I think over 30 different types of prey have been identified for gray whales. So they are capable of feeding on a wide variety of bottom dwelling prey, but I also mentioned swarms of mysid shrimp that are near kelp beds and rock outcroppings, herring larvae and herring spawn they're able to feed on, even occasionally krill. And I think gray whales, possibly because their main feeding ground is subjected to these variations with ice conditions, seem to have developed this very flexible repertoire to both explore and find new areas to feed, remember and come back to them, and also utilize a wide variety of prey types.
So I guess we'd have to look up where ghost shrimp inhabit. One question was, are ghost shrimp everywhere, or is this just a Puget Sound specialty diet?
They do occur in a wide variety of areas, but what makes these areas of Puget Sound, I think, optimal is that we've looked at, and this is actually early work that a researcher named Lori Whitecamp did and was confirmed later by some other researchers, the biomass density on these intertidal ghost shrimp beds, even though the gray whales can only access them for short periods of time, the density of prey in there in biomass is higher than where gray whales normally feed in the Bering Sea. So even though they can only feed there for short periods of time, that density is so high that they're able to get this payoff that makes it worthwhile.
Right, a high calorie buffet.
And this sort of holds for many of the even the lunge feeding whales. What really matters to them is density. This filter feeding mechanism that baleen whales have evolved can be incredibly costly and inefficient if prey density is low. But when prey densities are high, they can get this huge cost benefit ratio, but it all hinges on that density of prey.
Fabulous. All right, well, what do you think? Anything else there, Liz? Time for maybe one more? Did you have one on your list?
I do see some comments about other areas, and I will point out there are many areas that we see gray whales, especially in these years where there are unusual mortality events. And there are areas we periodically see gray whales where it's maybe not as positive a picture as what occurs with the sounders, where gray whales will be going through the motions of feeding, but many of the gray whales that are there are really emaciated and they don't seem to be doing well, and we'll often see many of those gray whales end up dead. So the sounders represent a portion of that group that has kind of hit pay dirt and learned to return there, but we also see on these stragglers from the migration that will show up, and they'll be trying to feed in areas, often staying in an area feeding, but don't seem to be getting the same payoff as what the sounders have learned and found.
And interesting that they are male mostly, and that it isn't a family affair. There aren't babies coming in to do this. It's a high energy system.
Yeah. But there is some learning going on in the sense that now that there are a bunch of gray whales doing that, and that heavy social interaction, like those gray whales I showed you following that one tagged whale, by having a core group there, it seems like other whales that come into that area can basically learn by following the other whales and socializing with them.
Right. Okay, Liz, did we have one more wrap-up-y question you want to?
Yeah, well, there's one question about if there's any data that that water temperature maybe causes UME, or is that one of the causes, perhaps? Water temperature?
Well, I think that's still a very open question. There's active research going on up in the Arctic areas, which is, I think, what primarily has affected the UME, and has, obviously the warming of the Arctic and the reduce in ice cover is one thing we're looking at. But as I mentioned, there are areas gray whales used to feed that now things have changed enough that you don't see gray whales feeding there anymore. But how much of that is the result of changes in productivity, some of it looks like changes in currents that have occurred. It turns out to be a more complicated picture of how their prey has changed. What we do know is that population has increased, and that's probably made them much more sensitive and vulnerable to any of these up and down variations in prey abundance.
Yes, fabulous. Very complicated. Yep.
No, I'm just wondering, like, those are pretty interesting videos, and I think a lot of people were very interested in seeing those. Are they on your, do you have them posted somewhere?
Yes, thanks for mentioning. If you go to our website, cascadiaresearch.org, there's a link to our YouTube channel. And it's something, just like I forgot to mention it, we've done a lousy job of promoting and getting these out there, but some of these videos I showed are on our YouTube channel. So if you go to that link and then scroll through, there's videos from some of our research in Hawaii and other areas, but you can find, I posted a bunch of these several years ago, and they're on our YouTube channel. And you can actually see some of the videos I didn't get a chance to show, including where the gray whales go down and lie on top of each other and interact in all sorts of interesting ways that we had no idea they were doing until we got a chance to look at this video footage.
Wow, fabulous. Okay, well, I think we really must keep ourselves moving along, but John, that is just fabulous. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And for all the other questions we didn't get to, we'll do our best to get the answers and send them off. Okay, thank you. Thank you
Nice
very
to
much.
talk to all of you. Have a good break
Yeah.
and next
Yeah,
talk.
and then stay for our seaweed. Next, we will have Josie Islin doing the Curious Worlds of Seaweeds.